We are thrilled to bring you today the former Chief Executive Officer of American Airlines, one of the most outspoken critics of deregulation. Robert Crandall joins us, and Clifford Winston, an authority in Washington on the effects of regulation, of course, with the Brookings Institution. Mr. Crandall, wonderful to have you here. My memory is a DC-4, a DC-6. I got my American Airline wings. Unfortunately, I've lost them. But, you know, I got my wings. I was 5 years old, and it was great. I threw up 3 times over the Berkshires. All that's gone.
This
industry is lousy. How did we get here?
Well, we got here in a whole lot of, it's a very competitive business. It's a business where it is extremely hard to control costs. It's a business that is very subject to extreme labor costs and very high fuel costs. It got here in a whole lot of ways. During the years of regulation, it made a modest profit. In the years since, it has failed to make its cost of capital.
Right.
And in fact, it's just a tough business, and will stay a tough business.
Clifford Winston, within your wonderful detailed work, can we get to a profit for our airline business? We seem to be in search of that profit for the last decade.
Well, we have got to a profit before, obviously, during expansions. The problem is this industry is yet to make a profit during a downturn. But I think it's certainly possible for the industry to get there, and they're taking steps to do so.
If you were still in the pilot seat of American Airlines, would you pursue the deal with U.S. Airways?
It's hard to say. I think that depends on what the pilots decide to do. The key issue, pilots have to agree on a seniority integration scheme. The two sides at U.S. Airways, the two airlines that came together, those pilots have still not agreed on seniority integration. You can't successfully do a merger unless that's done.
Clifford, when you look at this, and to Sarah's point on the merger, it still comes down to labor negotiations. If we rationalized airline labor costs as we did with automobiles?
I wouldn't say it comes down to labor negotiations. I mean, you have to look back at really what's the motivation for this merger. And in work that I've done in the past, there's sort of 2 big ticket items. One, access to international routes. That certainly makes sense for U.S. Airways because American has that. And 2, dealing with a failing firm. That is, you have a firm that's in trouble and they're looking for some sort of partner. But with American coming out of bankruptcy and presumably doing so with better and lower labor costs, you know, I think they really got to think twice about whether they really have an interest in pursuing this merger.
Bob, how difficult are these mergers to engineer?
Well, it's not so much engineering them. It's bringing together all the pieces.
What I mean. Yeah.
The IT is different. The culture is different. The processes are different. So they're very hard to do. Continental United, for example, is still struggling with it. I think it's doable. And I think there is some appeal to a combination between American and U.S. Airways, which would be bigger and would reach many more cities. But it needs that pilot integration cooperation.
Well, you keep going back to the pilots. I want to go back to the romance of the business, Clifford. We've all got that American image of flying, whatever that is for each individual. Are we delusionary to think we can get back to a rational business? Or do we need to bring the international carriers in? Or do we need more government intrusion back into the process?
First, let me be clear. This is and has been and will continue to be a rational business. What's left out of all of this is that this industry has suffered from tremendous shocks, adding fuel price increases, right, unanticipated reductions in demand from recessions, and of course September 11th. I don't think there's an industry in this country that has gone through the shocks that the American airline industry has gone through, and they're doing what they can to respond to these things after having decades of inefficiencies built up from regulation. So I think they're making progress and they can get there.
Well, I like this. Do you agree, like Hawaiian Airlines, Alaska Air with a more regional model doing better, where we can finally generate free cash flow and call it a real business? Or do we have to take the Air France model?
Well, the fact of the matter is, look, those sort of surveillance things that those individual, very regional carriers do okay. But the international carriers have not done okay.
Why not? Too much capacity?
Whole variety of reasons. Too much capacity. In some respects, way too much competition. and too little integration of the system as a whole.
But you're asking for government to police this. In recent writings, you have suggested we need to move the price up. Do we do that? Do the airlines do that, or does the government tell the airlines to bring the price up?
You can't go back to pure price regulation. But the fact is, what you can do is you can make policy that encourages the airlines to do what you want them to do. And you can stop penalizing U.S. carriers.
Clifford, one of my favorite morning must-reads came from you on Thanksgiving Day, writing about what the airline industry needs to do, allow foreign carriers in. You wrote that allowing them to serve any mid-size and regional airport in the United States that has lost service in the past few years. Soon Aunt Sally might enjoy the service on Singapore Airlines en route to Cincinnati. Clifford, not just because you wrote about Cincinnati, but why is this the solution for our airline industry in this country?
Well, I got a lot of nice holiday cards for that piece, too, I could add. Well, I think it's just important to have a long-run view of a global deregulated airline industry. That is an industry that can go everywhere in the same way that autos can produce cars in other countries. I'm looking for a truly global international airline industry where American carriers can produce in the U.S., and they have a sort of diversified portfolio. So that could be helpful. They can go international routes, they can go to other countries' domestic routes as well as their own routes. I think that would be very helpful given the vicissitudes in demand.
Push back on this, Bob Crandall. I can see American Airlines flying the Paris-Marseille route.
Oh, sure you can. And exactly how do we do that? We have pilots in Paris, we have pilots in Marseille. It doesn't make a bit of sense. And the fact of the matter is the U.S. government over many years has made it much more difficult for U.S. carriers to compete internationally by giving those international carriers rights in the United States that exceed the rights our carriers have abroad. I have never seen any sense in handicapping U.S. carriers by taking away their particular and exclusive access to the U.S. market.